The most dangerous words a person can say are not "I hate you," but "no one can stop me." And on a gray Thursday afternoon in Franklin Heights, Officer Derek Vaughn was about to learn exactly why. The city plaza outside City Hall buzzed with the usual rhythm of downtown life. People hurried past food carts. Office workers balanced coffee cups in one hand and phones in the other, and tourists paused beneath the old stone clock tower to take pictures. It looked like an ordinary day. But ordinary days have a way of becoming unforgettable when pride collides with truth. Derek Vaughn stood near the entrance of the plaza wearing a crisp police uniform and the expression of a man who believed the city belonged to him. For nearly 15 years, he had walked those streets with complete confidence. Some called him tough. Others called him intimidating. Either way, people usually stepped aside when he approached. That afternoon, his attention locked onto a woman crossing the square. Her name was Maya Brooks. She wore a navy blazer, dark slacks, and carried a simple leather folder beneath one arm. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. She moved calmly through the crowd, focused on her destination, ignoring the noise around her. But something about her presence seemed to irritate Derek instantly. His eyes narrowed. He watched her for several seconds before stepping directly into her path. Conversations nearby slowed. People sensed tension before a single word was spoken. Maya stopped and looked at him quietly. Derek demanded identification in a sharp voice that echoed across the plaza. Maya remained composed. She asked if there was a problem. The question seemed to make him even more irritated. Several pedestrians slowed down to watch. A teenager lifted his phone and began recording. Derek took a step closer and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. He questioned her purpose. He questioned her right to be there. He questioned her confidence. Yet Maya never raised her voice. She simply met his gaze with an expression so calm that it felt almost out of place amid the growing tension. Then Derek smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone convinced he held all the power. He spread his arms slightly and glanced around at the gathering crowd, as if inviting them to witness what came next. "I am the law around here," he declared. The words hung in the air. Some people looked away. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Maya said nothing for a moment. The city seemed quieter somehow. Even the distant traffic sounded muted. Then she looked directly at him and asked a simple question. "Are you sure about that?" A few people frowned, confused by her response. Derek laughed. To him, it sounded like surrender. To Maya, it sounded like the beginning of the end. Because what Derek Vaughn did not know was that dozens of eyes were already watching. What he did not know was that this encounter had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And what he definitely did not know was that in less than 3 hours, the badge on his chest would mean absolutely nothing. The crowd continued to grow around the plaza, drawn by the invisible force that always pulls people toward conflict. Some stood on the courthouse steps. Others lingered beside food carts and newspaper stands. A few whispered to one another, trying to figure out what was happening. Officer Derek Vaughn seemed to enjoy the attention. His posture grew taller with every passing second, and the confidence in his voice became impossible to ignore. Maya Brooks, meanwhile, remained perfectly still. She neither argued nor protested. She simply watched him. That calmness unsettled people more than anger ever could. Imagine standing there while someone questions your place in public, challenges your character, and tries to make an example out of you. Most people would rush to defend themselves. Most people would speak louder. Maya did neither. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the glass buildings surrounding the square, casting long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang the half-hour. The city moved on as though nothing important was happening. Yet for those standing nearby, it felt like time had slowed. Derek asked more questions. Maya answered only when necessary. Her voice remained measured and professional. The contrast between them became impossible to miss. One appeared determined to dominate the moment. The other appeared completely unafraid of it. Several people exchanged uneasy glances. An elderly man sitting on a nearby bench quietly shook his head. A young woman holding a shopping bag lowered her phone for a moment and frowned. Something about the encounter felt wrong, though no one could quite explain why. Then a black SUV rolled past the far side of the plaza. Most people ignored it. Maya did not. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the vehicle before returning to Derek. The movement lasted less than a second, but it was enough to suggest there was more happening beneath the surface than anyone realized. Derek noticed none of it. He was too focused on maintaining control. Franklin Heights had become his stage, and he believed everyone present was part of his audience. What he did not understand was that audiences can change sides very quickly. A light breeze swept through the square, carrying scraps of conversation across the crowd. Somewhere behind the gathering, a man in a gray suit stopped walking and quietly observed the scene. Across the street, another person appeared to be speaking into a wireless earpiece. None of it seemed connected. None of it seemed important. Not yet. Maya glanced once more at the courthouse clock. 3 hours. That was all she thought about. 3 hours until everything hidden would come into the open. 3 hours until people would stop asking who she was and start asking what Derek Vaughn had done. She folded her hands calmly in front of her and looked directly at him. Derek mistook her silence for weakness. The crowd mistook it for patience. But neither explanation was correct. Maya was not waiting because she was powerless. She was waiting because she already knew something that nobody else in that plaza knew. And the closer Derek moved toward his next decision, the closer he came to discovering the truth for himself. Maya Brooks had learned long ago that the strongest people in the room were rarely the loudest. While the crowd focused on Officer Derek Vaughn, she focused on details. The courthouse clock above the plaza, the reflections in nearby windows, the expressions on the faces around her. Every second mattered. Every reaction told a story. Derek continued speaking with the certainty of a man who had never been seriously challenged. He paced slowly across the pavement, occasionally glancing toward the growing audience that surrounded them. The attention energized him. People recorded with their phones. Others whispered predictions about what would happen next. Some assumed Maya had done something wrong. Others simply wanted to witness the outcome. Few understood they were watching the beginning of something much larger than a disagreement in a public square. Maya stood quietly beneath the shadow of the clock tower. Her expression never changed. Yet behind that calm exterior, her mind remained active. She remembered arriving in Franklin Heights 6 months earlier. She remembered studying reports, reviewing complaints, and listening to stories that most people never heard. Stories from business owners, city employees, and ordinary residents who believed nobody would ever take them seriously. Again and again, one name had appeared. Derek Vaughn. At first, the pattern seemed difficult to prove. Individual incidents rarely tell the whole story. But when enough pieces are placed together, a picture begins to emerge. Maya knew that better than anyone. The breeze carried the distant sound of traffic through the downtown streets. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed briefly before fading away. Life continued around them. Yet Maya could feel the atmosphere shifting. People who had initially watched with curiosity were beginning to look at Derek differently. Not because of anything she had said, because of what he was revealing about himself. There is a moment in every story when someone believes they are winning. That moment can be dangerous. Confidence becomes arrogance. Caution disappears. Small mistakes become larger ones. Maya recognized that moment immediately. Derek had entered it. He believed the crowd supported him. He believed his authority was unquestioned. Most importantly, he believed Maya posed no threat at all. Across the street, the man in the gray suit remained near a newspaper box. Another observer stood outside a coffee shop pretending to read messages on a phone. Neither drew attention. Neither appeared connected to the situation. Yet Maya noticed both. She noticed everything. A faint smile almost appeared at the corner of her mouth before disappearing just as quickly. Not because she enjoyed what was happening, because she knew the truth was moving closer with every passing minute. Derek suddenly stopped pacing and looked directly at her again. The confidence in his eyes suggested he expected fear, frustration, or surrender. Instead, he found the same steady composure that had greeted him from the beginning. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. It lasted less than a second. Most people missed it completely. Maya did not. She simply adjusted her grip on the leather folder beneath her arm and glanced once more toward the courthouse clock. 2 hours and 47 minutes remained. And somewhere beyond the edges of the plaza, events were already unfolding that would soon change everything. The afternoon sun drifted lower above Franklin Heights, painting the upper floors of the courthouse in shades of gold and amber. The crowd had nearly doubled since the confrontation began. Some people remained because they were curious. Others stayed because something deep inside them sensed that this story was not heading where they originally expected. Derek Vaughn continued to occupy the center of attention. He spoke with confidence, answered questions from bystanders, and carried himself like a man completely certain of his position. Maya Brooks remained calm. The difference between them had become impossible to ignore. One was working hard to control the moment. The other seemed content to let the moment unfold on its own. A local reporter arrived carrying a camera bag and notebook. She quietly asked several witnesses what they had seen. Across the plaza, more phones appeared. Videos were being uploaded. Messages were being shared. The encounter was beginning to travel beyond the boundaries of the square. Yet Derek seemed unconcerned. In fact, the growing attention appeared to encourage him. He glanced toward Maya and asked why she had come to Franklin Heights in the first place. The question drew immediate interest from the crowd. For the first time, people leaned forward, hoping to hear an answer. Maya studied him carefully before responding. "I came here to do my job." Her answer sounded simple, almost ordinary. Derek laughed. Several people around him followed. To them, it sounded vague and evasive. To Maya, it was the complete truth. What nobody knew was that 6 months earlier she had arrived in the city carrying a mission that extended far beyond any single person. She had spent countless hours reviewing records, meeting sources, and observing patterns hidden beneath everyday events. She learned which complaints disappeared. She learned which concerns were ignored. She learned how influence could quietly reshape outcomes before most people even noticed. Franklin Heights looked peaceful from the outside. Beneath the surface, however, certain questions had remained unanswered for far too long. Maya had come to find those answers. A gust of wind swept through the plaza, rustling flags mounted outside City Hall. The sound briefly interrupted the conversations around them. Maya looked upward for a moment. Her expression softened slightly, as though remembering something important. She thought about the people she had met during the previous months. The retired teacher who felt ignored. The business owner who stopped filing complaints because nothing changed. The city employee who feared speaking publicly. Their faces remained fresh in her memory. Their stories had brought her here. Derek mistook her silence for hesitation. He stepped forward and addressed the crowd again, presenting himself as the guardian of order. Several people nodded. Others remained uncertain. The atmosphere had changed. The automatic trust he once enjoyed no longer felt automatic. Questions were forming. Doubts were spreading. Even those who supported him seemed less comfortable than before. Maya noticed every reaction. She also noticed something else. The black SUV had returned. This time it parked farther down the block. 2 individuals exited the vehicle and disappeared into a nearby government building. The movement lasted only seconds. Nobody in the crowd paid attention. Maya did. She glanced toward the courthouse clock once again. 2 hours and 19 minutes remained. The pieces were moving exactly as expected. Derek believed he was controlling the story. In reality, he was walking deeper into one that had begun long before he ever stepped into the plaza. The clock above the courthouse now showed a little after 3 in the afternoon. Long shadows stretched across the plaza, and the energy of the crowd had changed once again. What had started as curiosity was slowly becoming scrutiny. People were no longer watching only Maya Brooks. They were watching Officer Derek Vaughn as well. Every word he spoke seemed to attract more attention than before. Every decision appeared heavier. Yet Derek remained convinced that he controlled the situation. Confidence can be deceptive. Sometimes it blinds people to the moment when everything begins to shift beneath their feet. Maya stood quietly near the base of the courthouse steps, her leather folder tucked beneath one arm. She appeared patient, almost detached from the spectacle surrounding her. But her eyes remained alert. She was measuring reactions, observing movements, and noticing details others overlooked. Across the street, the reporter continued gathering statements. Several videos from the plaza had already spread across social media. More cameras were pointed in their direction than Derek realized. A city employee hurried out of a nearby office building, slowed upon seeing the crowd, and immediately reached for a phone. The story was growing. Derek, however, saw only an opportunity to reinforce his authority. He stepped closer to Maya and demanded additional identification. Maya calmly informed him that she had already answered his questions. Her voice never rose. Her expression never changed. The response irritated him. The crowd noticed. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. They expected frustration from Maya. Instead, all the visible frustration belonged to Derek. That difference mattered. It was becoming impossible to ignore. Then Derek made a decision. At the time, it felt insignificant. A routine action. Something he believed would prove his control over the situation. He reached toward the leather folder Maya had carried throughout the afternoon and insisted on reviewing its contents. Maya's eyes locked onto his for the first time in several minutes. The air seemed to grow still. Even nearby conversations faded. She spoke slowly and clearly. "Officer Vaughn, I would advise you to reconsider." Her tone contained no threat, no anger, only certainty. The words should have made him pause. Instead, they had the opposite effect. Derek interpreted them as resistance. The crowd watched closely. The reporter lowered her notebook and focused entirely on the exchange. Somewhere beyond the plaza, another black SUV turned onto Main Street. Maya noticed it immediately. Derek did not. He remained focused on proving a point. He repeated his demand. Maya remained calm. For a brief moment, a flicker of concern crossed the faces of the individuals quietly observing from a distance. They knew something Derek did not. They understood the significance of what he was about to do. Maya gave him one final opportunity. "Some decisions cannot be undone," she said softly. The words lingered between them. Derek smiled dismissively. He believed she was bluffing. He believed this was another attempt to challenge his authority. What he could not see was that the story had already moved beyond him. Events were unfolding in conference rooms, government offices, and secure phone calls throughout the city. Pieces were falling into place. Evidence was being reviewed. Names were being discussed. And with a single unnecessary decision, Derek had just placed himself at the center of everything. Maya glanced once more at the courthouse clock. 2 hours remained. For the first time all afternoon, she looked completely at peace. Because the mistake that would change Derek Vaughn's life had finally been made. The atmosphere in Franklin Heights changed in ways that could not be measured or explained. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. Cars continued moving through downtown streets. Storefront doors opened and closed. The courthouse clock continued its steady march forward. Yet beneath that ordinary afternoon, an invisible current was building strength. Maya Brooks could feel it. The people quietly observing from a distance could feel it. Only Derek Vaughn remained unaware. He stood near the courthouse steps, speaking confidently to several bystanders who had gathered around him. To them, he appeared certain. To Maya, he appeared distracted. The difference mattered. When people become convinced they are untouchable, they often stop noticing what is happening around them. Maya remained exactly where she had been for most of the afternoon. Calm, patient, watching. Her leather folder rested securely beneath her arm. The reporter continued collecting statements from witnesses. Several individuals who had originally planned to leave stayed longer. Something about the situation kept pulling them back. Questions had begun replacing assumptions. Why had Maya remained so composed? Why had she never attempted to defend herself publicly? Why did she seem more concerned with time than with the confrontation itself? The answers were closer than anyone realized. A few blocks away, inside a federal office building, several people sat around a conference table reviewing documents. Screens displayed timelines, reports, interviews, and recordings collected over many months. Names appeared across those files. Incidents, complaints, internal communications. Patterns that seemed unrelated when viewed separately suddenly formed a much larger picture when examined together. Maya had spent half a year helping assemble those pieces. Every interview, every report, every observation. Nothing had been accidental. Back in the plaza, another black SUV quietly arrived and parked near the curb. No lights, no attention, no urgency. Two individuals stepped out carrying briefcases and entered the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Maya noticed. Derek did not. He remained focused on maintaining the image he had carefully built for years. Yet that image was beginning to crack. The reporter received a message on her phone and frowned. She read it twice before glancing toward Maya. Across the plaza, the man in the gray suit checked his watch and quietly nodded to someone standing near the courthouse entrance. Small movements, small signals, easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. Maya knew exactly what they meant. The process had begun. Imagine standing in the center of a story without realizing you are no longer the one controlling it. Imagine believing every eye is watching your strength when, in reality, They are starting to notice your mistakes. That was where Derek stood now. The crowd still listened to him, but something had changed. The certainty that once surrounded him no longer felt solid. Doubt had entered the conversation. Maya looked toward the courthouse clock again. 1 hour and 29 minutes remained. For the first time all day, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. Not because victory was guaranteed, not because the work was finished, but because the truth no longer depended on her words. The evidence existed. The witnesses existed. The records existed. And somewhere behind the walls of the courthouse, people with the authority to act were already preparing to do exactly that. At 4:31 in the afternoon, the courthouse clock released a deep metallic chime that echoed across Franklin Heights. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Something was happening. The large courthouse doors opened, and a group of sharply dressed officials stepped outside with the calm confidence of people who knew exactly why they were there. No flashing lights. No dramatic announcements. Just quiet authority. The crowd instinctively parted as they crossed the plaza. Derek Vaughn noticed them immediately. At first, he seemed pleased. He straightened his uniform and lifted his chin slightly, assuming their arrival would reinforce his position. But then something unexpected happened. The officials walked past him without hesitation. Every one of them moved directly toward Maya Brooks. A silence settled over the plaza. It spread from person to person like a wave. The reporter lowered her phone. The man in the gray suit stepped forward for the first time all afternoon. Even the people who had only stopped to watch for a few minutes suddenly sensed they were witnessing something important. Maya remained exactly where she was. Calm, composed, unmoved. One of the officials stopped in front of her and offered a respectful nod. "Director Brooks," he said clearly, "the review team is assembled and ready." The words seemed to freeze the entire plaza. Director Brooks. Several people repeated the title under their breath. Others looked at one another in confusion. Derek's expression changed instantly. The certainty that had carried him through the afternoon flickered for the first time. "Director?" someone in the crowd whispered. Another official opened a portfolio and quietly handed Maya a folder. She accepted it without surprise, as though this moment had been expected all along. Because it had. For 6 months, she had operated quietly inside Franklin Heights as the lead coordinator of a federal integrity review examining patterns of misconduct, administrative failures, and abuses of authority within multiple departments across the city. She had listened, observed, documented, verified. Every step had been deliberate. Every report had been checked. Every claim had been supported by evidence. The plaza that once viewed her as an unknown visitor now stared at her with stunned disbelief. Derek took a slow step forward. "What is this?" he asked. For the first time all day, his voice lacked confidence. Maya looked at him steadily. There was no anger in her eyes. No satisfaction. Only professionalism. "This is the truth catching up," she replied. The reporter immediately began recording. Phones rose throughout the crowd. The officials continued their work with quiet efficiency. One by one, documents were exchanged. Names were confirmed. Procedures were initiated. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody celebrated. The moment felt larger than any individual. It was the culmination of months of work finally stepping into daylight. Derek glanced around the plaza as though searching for support. Instead, he found uncertainty. People who had once watched him with admiration now watched him with questions. Maya looked briefly toward the courthouse clock. Less than an hour remained before the formal review would begin inside the building behind them. The waiting was over. The mystery was gone. Franklin Heights finally knew who Maya Brooks was. And for the first time all afternoon, Derek Vaughn realized he had never truly understood the situation he thought he controlled. The formal review began at 5 o'clock inside the historic courthouse overlooking Franklin Heights. By then, word had spread far beyond the plaza. Local reporters filled the rear rows. City officials occupied seats near the front. Residents who had followed the story throughout the afternoon waited quietly, hoping for answers. The atmosphere felt different from the crowd outside. There was no excitement here. No cheering. Only anticipation. Maya Brooks sat at a long table beside members of the federal review team. Her expression remained calm and professional. Months of preparation had led to this moment. Across the room, Derek Vaughn appeared noticeably different from the man who had stood confidently in the plaza earlier that day. The certainty that once surrounded him seemed diminished beneath the weight of unanswered questions. One by one, documented records were presented. Timelines appeared on large screens. Verified complaints were reviewed. Witness statements were summarized. Administrative reports that had once been scattered across different departments were finally assembled into a single narrative. The room grew quieter with each presentation. Patterns that seemed insignificant in isolation became impossible to ignore when viewed together. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. Facts have a way of speaking for themselves. Several city officials exchanged concerned glances as the scope of the findings became clear. Members of the public listened carefully. Some recognized incidents they had heard about years earlier. Others were learning about them for the first time. Maya spoke only when necessary. She explained procedures, clarified timelines, and answered questions with precision. There was no emotion in her delivery, no desire for revenge. The purpose of the review had never been punishment for its own sake. Its purpose was accountability. As the evening progressed, additional evidence was introduced. Internal communications, verified records, independent reviews. Every piece strengthened the same conclusion. The problems being examined were not isolated misunderstandings. They reflected a larger failure that required immediate action. Shortly after 6 o'clock, the review panel reached its preliminary findings. The announcement was brief but significant. Administrative proceedings would move forward. Multiple cases would be reopened. Independent oversight measures would be implemented. And Derek Vaughn would be removed from active duty pending the outcome of further investigations. The words landed with remarkable simplicity. No dramatic music. No emotional speeches. Just consequences. Real consequences. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then reporters began typing furiously. Phones lit up across the room. Messages traveled through the city in seconds. Outside the courthouse, residents gathered near television screens and storefront windows as the news spread. Years of assumptions collapsed beneath the weight of documented truth. Maya listened quietly as the announcement concluded. She felt no satisfaction, only relief. Relief for the people who had stepped forward despite their fears. Relief for the witnesses who believed nobody would listen. Relief that the truth no longer depended on private conversations and confidential files. It now existed in the open where everyone could see it. Through the courthouse windows, the last light of day faded beyond the skyline. Franklin Heights looked the same as it had that morning. The streets remained. The buildings remained. The clock tower still stood above the plaza. Yet something fundamental had changed. A story that began with authority had ended with accountability. And for the first time in a very long time, many people in that city believed that fairness might actually have a chance. The courthouse emptied slowly as evening settled over Franklin Heights. The last reporters packed away their equipment. City employees headed home. Residents lingered outside beneath the glow of streetlights, discussing what they had witnessed throughout the day. For many of them, it felt like the end of a chapter they never believed would close. Maya Brooks stepped out of the courthouse carrying the same leather folder she had brought with her months earlier. The night air was cool and quiet. Across the plaza, the old clock tower stood illuminated against the darkening sky. It looked exactly as it had that morning. Yet everything felt different. The city was different. The conversation was different. The future was different. Maya paused near the courthouse steps and looked across the nearly empty square. She remembered the first day she arrived in Franklin Heights. She remembered the warnings, the doubts, the people who believed nothing would ever change. She remembered the voices that told her the effort would be too difficult and the resistance too strong. But she also remembered something else. The courage of ordinary people. The business owner who agreed to tell the truth despite the risks. The city worker who shared information because it was the right thing to do. The residents who refused to stop believing that accountability mattered. Real change rarely begins with powerful people. More often, it begins with ordinary people deciding they are no longer willing to remain silent. A few yards away, several members of the review team waited beside a vehicle. They were tired. Months of work had finally reached its conclusion. One of them asked Maya if she was ready to leave. She smiled softly but did not answer right away. Instead, she looked once more toward the center of the plaza where the entire story had begun. Earlier that afternoon, many people had mistaken authority for strength. They had mistaken confidence for truth. By the end of the day, they understood the difference. Authority without integrity is temporary. Truth has a way of enduring. The courthouse clock struck 7. Its deep chime rolled through the city one final time. Maya finally turned toward her colleagues and began walking across the plaza. Her work in Franklin Heights was finished. The investigations would continue. The reforms would move forward. New leaders would have difficult decisions ahead. But those challenges belonged to tomorrow. Tonight belonged to the people who had waited years to see accountability become reality. As Maya reached the edge of the square, she glanced back one last time. The lights of the city stretched into the distance. Cars moved through intersections. Families headed home. Life continued. It always does. Yet somewhere in Franklin Heights, a lesson would be remembered for a very long time. Not because of a courtroom, not because of a report, not because of a title or a badge. It would be remembered because one person believed power made him untouchable, while another understood that real power comes from responsibility. The difference between those two ideas changed everything. And as the lights of the city shimmered beneath the night sky, one truth remained impossible to ignore. He thought the law belonged to him, but the law had never belonged to any one person. It belonged to the truth.